Several reports say that the DOJ, Department of Justice, has launched an antitrust probe into UnitedHealth. Companies has drawn scrutiny in recent years. It's broadened its reach across the healthcare sector. Our next guest says the move seems a little late. Joining us now, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's a CNBC contributor, serves on the boards of Illumina and Pfizer. And Scott, I've said, and not entirely jokingly, that this business is a great business to be in. And if you do operate it a certain way, there are some gray areas that can be almost self-serving in the way things work, depending on which operations you're talking about, where one hand can kind of, or you can sort of wash the other at the same time. UnitedHealthcare has been doing it for years.
Well, look, I heard the last conversation. A lot of this consolidation that you're seeing in the marketplace, and this has been underway for about 15 years, I think it really accelerated after the Affordable Care Act, is a result of the fact that CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, systematically underpays doctors, certainly for Medicaid and increasingly for Medicare as well, that doctors lose money and hospitals lose money on their Medicare lines of business. And so what they've done in response to that is they've consolidated. They've sold their practices to hospitals and to insurance companies. And those entities have used the scale that they've acquired to gain efficiencies and also drive up prices, cost shift to the private market, to privately insured patients. CMS has been aware of this. I was in the government, and we were aware of it when I was there. Certainly, CMS was aware of it under the Obama administration. You know, what DOJ bemoans, CMS in some regards, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, I think accepts, if not applauds, because it allows them to systematically underpay under those government programs. The result is, as you've noted, about 50% of all markets, according to a recent survey by the American Medical Association, are controlled by one large insurer, and 50%, more than 50% of physicians are controlled by one large insurer in 50% of the markets across the U.S. So you do have consolidation now. These acquisitions have been largely Pac-Man acquisitions. Insurers and hospitals have bought up doctors in sort of onesies and twosies. They've done some big acquisitions, but a lot of this has been under the radar.
Scott, could a defense on the part of UnitedHealth be that medical loss ratios are through the roof at this point, or is that neither here nor there? It's not like their margins are amazing because they've made all these acquisitions. We've seen it in the latest quarter that MLRs are just skyrocketing.
Yeah, look, they're facing litigation in California right now. This may be just the DOJ investigating whether or not it wants to join that federal suit. So in Northern California, Eminent Health has filed suit against UnitedHealthcare, alleging that UnitedHealthcare's group Optum, which owns the physicians, they own about 90,000 physicians across the U.S., came to that healthcare group and said, we don't want to compete for primary care physicians in this local market. And when that healthcare group refused to do that, they're alleging that Optum froze them out of some contracts. And so this investigation, there wasn't a lot of detail around it, could be the DOJ making an assessment whether or not they want to join that suit. I don't think the fact that insurers run on tight margins is going to be part of their defense. I think they're going to have to go market by market if there are allegations in specific markets that they have too much concentration and there's unfair business practices taking place in those markets. But it is the case, that insurers aren't doing well either. They're seeing reimbursement go down under Medicare and Medicaid. I think this is a problem with systematically underpaying providers through certain government programs and hoping that, those providers can make it up in other parts of the market. You're going to see business arrangements like this that ultimately increase concentration in the markets as people try to react to the fact that they're not being paid, a fair wage on certain services. If you look at hospitals right now and you look across their lines of business, they literally lose, 10 to 20% on most Medicare lines of business outside of cardiology, urology, maybe some other high-price services. And what happens also is they overinvest in those services. So you get too many cardiology suites in hospitals because that's the one place they can make money.
Well, all that is none of that is the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to go where you're needed. I think healthcare inflation has moderated. It's all we talked about 5 years ago. Scott, is that because of what you're talking about? Is that actually a good thing? What we've seen with CMS and with reimbursement?
Well, look, there is some arguments that could be made that the consolidation has driven efficiencies, that doctors practicing in small group practices isn't the most efficient way to deliver health care, that when you aggregate doctors into these large networks, you can deploy services, information technology, other kinds of services that can help reduce costs and increase efficiency. And I think that's certainly been true. And I think Optum and UnitedHealthcare and other insurers, as they've come in to acquire these doctor practices, have introduced reforms and new business arrangements that have increased efficiency. And that's certainly part of why inflation has moderated in recent years. But, if you talk to the doctors, they'll argue, in the hospitals, they'll argue that they're getting squeezed, that they're losing money on a lot of the government business, and that they've had to make up for it by shifting costs to privately insured patients. And there's only so much they can do. There's only so much cost that they can shift to the privately insured patients before you start to see too much inflation in employer-provided insurance, and the employers push back. And I think that's what's happening now in most markets.
I mean, you don't see any. They've dealt with physicians that are a group that might own an imaging lab over prescribing procedures. I mean, that's a thing of the past mostly, is it not? Is that part of this?
Yeah. The Stark provisions, have been in place for decades, and the ability to self-refer, which is what you're referring to, buy a radiology practice and refer your own radiology practice, that has largely been extinguished from the market. There are certain places where it's allowed, but it's very closely scrutinized by regulators. I think this is probably, there's some suggestion in the Wall Street Journal article, this is more related to how Optum is contracting for provider services in markets where it owns a lot of the physicians. Again, it may be related to the Eminent Health federal lawsuit that's already underway. We'll find out more in about 2 weeks when United files its 10K. But, they've stepped in recent years to block mergers, acquisitions of large provider practices by hospitals and insurance companies. So the FTC has been waking up to this. It's hard to police because a lot of the acquisitions aren't in big purchases. They're what I said was Pac-Man acquisitions, buying up small doctor practices in local markets that fall under the radar. And final point here, remember, all healthcare is local. So, if you control 50, 60% of a local market, that's a monopoly. Even if you don't control 50 or 60% of the market across the entire United States, most people get their healthcare locally. And if one entity, a hospital or insurance company, owns most of the providers, they're dealing with a monopoly in their local market.